and when you feel as if you'd like to play something a little bit scary. For 33 years, Fred Rogers made children feel safe on TV, but after he died in 2003, his wife Joanne revealed something nobody knew. Every year on his birthday, Fred wrote a letter to God. He questioned whether his work mattered and if he was doing enough. He kept over 30 of those letters locked away, asking Joanne to keep them private while he was alive. But that wasn't the only thing he hid. In 1986, he wrote a manuscript so raw that publishers refused to print it. What Fred Rogers kept hidden will leave you in shock. Fred Rogers was born on March 20, 1928 in Latrobe, Pennsylvania. His father, James, had just built a mansion with heated floors and a private elevator. His mother, Nancy, came from a banking family. Despite all this wealth, Fred spent his early years mostly alone. Their estate had 47 acres, but it felt empty. His father was rarely home, working long days at the steel plant. And even with 3 servants around, Fred just wanted someone to talk to. That deep loneliness made him crave emotional closeness more than toys or luxury. At age 2, Fred got both measles and scarlet fever during the Great Depression. It was a terrifying time. 15% of children in Pennsylvania who got both illnesses didn't survive. Fred was stuck in bed for 47 days. His fever went above 104 and he began hallucinating. But during those long nights, his mother sat beside him every day. She taught him how to play melodies on the black piano keys because the fever had left his fingers too weak for the others. Each black key was an emotion. That piano became his first real friend. When he turned 3, Fred couldn't tie his shoes or even use a fork properly. Doctors said he had severe developmental dyspraxia and might never improve. One doctor suggested he should be sent away to an institution, but his parents hired a physical therapist named Margaret Thompson. She brought puppets to therapy and made Fred's fingers dance by making the puppets move. Within 6 months, Fred's hand coordination improved by 300%. He still needed Velcro shoes until age 12, but he never forgot how something fun, like puppetry, helped him heal. That same year, on September 15th, a train derailed just 400 YD from their home. Fred stood at his window and saw the wreck. 47 people died. His father told him they were just sleeping, but Fred learned the truth when he read a newspaper headline. The horror stayed with him. He asked his mother, why do people get hurt when they're just trying to go somewhere? It became one of the core questions he tried to answer in his later work. By the time he was 5, Fred spent hours alone in the attic using old socks to perform puppet shows. He gave each puppet a voice and a story. His audience was a row of stuffed animals. One day, his mother walked in and saw him conducting what looked like a classroom. She was so moved, she had a real puppet theater made for him, complete with red velvet curtains and lights. He named his favorite puppet David the Dreamer. The themes he explored back then, fear, kindness, belonging, would later appear in every episode of his show. At age 6, Fred was baptized. His grandmother gave him a set of handmade felt board Bible stories. She didn't shy away from tough questions. When Fred asked, why does God let kids suffer? She answered, God wants us to wonder. They had these conversations every week for 4 years. She taught him that asking was part of faith. That belief would later define how Fred talked to children about life, never pretending to have all the answers, but always showing he cared. In high school, Fred was bullied. He was tall but skinny, with a high voice, and kids called him Squeaky. One day, 3 football players shoved him into a locker during a lunch. No one punished them. He tried playing piano at assemblies, but the crowd mocked him and threw paper planes. Once they poured chocolate milk on his sheet music, he began seeing a therapist. His mother almost moved him to another school, but Fred stayed, quietly building his resilience. When he was 15, hay fever made him miss almost half the school year. While stuck at home, he composed his first full piece of music. It was called Melody for String Quartet in D minor. It had 247 measures and was so complex that his teacher couldn't believe he wrote it. When it was performed publicly, his classmates laughed and called it funeral music. But Fred kept writing. The piece is still kept in the Fred Rogers archive. His relationship with his father was strained. James Rogers had survived the 1918 Spanish flu, but never dealt with the trauma. He wanted his son to be strong, to run the steel business. Fred just wanted to create. In his diary, Fred wrote, it's been 23 days since he asked how I felt. On his 17th birthday, Fred broke a window while practicing with puppets. His father grounded him for a month, banned piano, and made him work at the steelyard. His hands blistered so badly he couldn't play for 3 weeks. Later, James gave Fred an ultimatum. Stop the puppet nonsense, or find your own way. Fred chose his own way. When his brother Jim was born in 1937, Fred was 9. He didn't handle it well. He hid the baby's bottles and refused to speak for 6 weeks. Psychologists were brought in. Fred only communicated through notes and drawings, some of them disturbing. He admitted, years later, I wanted Jim to disappear so you would love me again. That guilt never left him. It helped shape his mission to make every child feel seen and valued. In 5. Fred volunteered for civil defense. His job was to watch the skies for enemy bombers. One night in March, radar picked up a possible threat. Fred stood on a rooftop for 4 hours, believing an attack was coming. It turned out to be American planes, but the fear was real. He started having nightmares about fire from the sky. That's when he decided he would never include violence in anything he created for children. He transferred to Rollins College in 1948 to study music. He graduated magna cum laude in 1951. He was deeply involved choirs, music clubs, even intramural swimming. He won several awards, but during one performance, his girlfriend mocked his stutter in front of others. Fred was crushed. To fix it, he taught himself breath control by speaking underwater. That's how he developed his slow, careful speech. It wasn't natural. It was built from struggle. After graduation, he worked in television and studied theology at lunch. In 1963, he was ordained not to preach in a church, but to serve children through television. His friend, Reverend Bill Barker, helped make that happen. Fred believed a TV show could be a form of ministry, a place where children could feel safe and understood. His most famous early song was Let's Be Together Today. Written in 1950, he used musical tension to reflect emotional conflict. He could hear any tune and replay it instantly. He composed over 200 songs, often with jazz pianist Johnny Costa. Even as a kid, Fred played carols on loudspeakers for his neighborhood. Music was always how he connected. In seminary, Fred had a secret. He played jazz piano at underground clubs, earning $5 a night. His religious upbringing frowned on secular music, so he kept it hidden. But that jazz background gave his songs their richness. Beneath the calm surface of Mr. Rogers was an artist who took risks. He met Joanne at Rollins in 1948. She was on the welcome committee. They didn't know much about love, but they grew together. In 1952, Fred proposed through a handwritten letter. She was so excited she lost the letter, running to a payphone to say yes. They were both 24 when they married, and their 50-year marriage was the anchor that held everything together. Fred Rogers landed his first big break in television. In 1951, just 23 years old, working at NBC in New York, he thought he'd finally made it. But that excitement didn't last. He worked behind the scenes on shows like The Kate Smith Hour and The Gabby Hayes Show. But what disturbed him the most was what passed as entertainment for children. He watched grown adults throw pies in each other's faces while kids laughed in the audience. And something about that just didn't sit right with him. It wasn't just silly, it felt wrong. The breaking point came fast. After only 6 weeks, Fred walked out. He told everyone he had seen enough. This was supposed to be his dream, but it turned into something he couldn't stand to be a part of. 3 years later in Pittsburgh, Fred got another chance. This time he started something from scratch. In April 1954, he co-created a small children's show called The Children's Corner on WQED. The entire show ran on just $150 a week, split between Fred and his co-host Josie Carey. They didn't even have proper materials. Fred had one yellow legal pad to plan an entire year's worth of content. The studio was a mess. Fred had to run from the puppet stage to the organ and back again during live broadcasts, which is why he switched to wearing sneakers. The puppets weren't even part of the original plan. Daniel Tiger was born the night before the station launched, made from a sock handed to him by the station manager. Fred ended up voicing all 13 puppet characters live every day, making up dialogue on the spot. Josie never knew what was coming next, and somehow it all worked. By 1955, Fred decided he wanted something special to move across the screen, a tiny red trolley. But there was no money for fancy props, so he built it himself from scraps. The entire thing cost just $18. It was only 1.5 in long, and Fred used tweezers and a magnifying glass to glue every little part into place. Then he operated it live alongside all the puppets while still running to the organ. One day, after filming a long episode about sharing, Fred collapsed from exhaustion right there on the studio floor. That's how much he gave to the show. He'd been married to Joanne since 1952, but all this pressure was starting to weigh on their relationship. In 1956, something happened that Fred would carry with him for the rest of his life. In the middle of an argument about how poorly the show was doing, Fred smashed one of his puppets. Just like that, gone. It was completely unlike him. They weren't the kind of couple that shouted, but this time, things broke. Years later, he used that very moment, his outburst, the guilt, as a way to teach children about managing their own anger. Even with all the stress, Fred kept creating. By 1957, he had written over 200 original songs for the show, including one tune that would become iconic, Won't You Be My Neighbor. He wrote it after getting a letter from a child who felt alone. Fred played every song on a baby grand piano he pulled out of a Pittsburgh junkyard. He fixed it up and brought it to life. And when he came home from stomach cancer surgery years later, the first thing he did was sit at that piano and play. Over time, he wrote 13 full operas for kids, all while barely sleeping and holding the entire production. together by sheer will. Then in 1958, Pittsburgh flooded. One episode focused on the flood and what it meant for the community. The response was overwhelming. Fred received 500 letters that week alone. Most of them were from kids who had lost pets. Fred cried reading them, not in private, on air. He read their stories with tears running down his face. And then he did something nobody expected. He personally wrote back to every single child. In 1963, he took another risk. He left the US and moved to Canada to start a show called Mr. Rogers on CBC. It ran for nearly 900 episodes. But he wanted to come back home. When he returned in 1968 and rebranded the show as Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, the reviews were brutal. Variety called it boring therapy. The Washington Post said he was too slow and too calm. Ratings barely hit 2.1 million, while other shows were getting 10 million. He got letters calling him creepy. But Fred refused to change. He believed children needed time to feel and think. Even if adults didn't understand it. Behind the camera, he had a secret no one knew about. In 1968, he built the trolley factory, set himself using real tools from his father's steel mill. He also built a hidden room inside King Friday's castle, a treasure vault where he stored over 1,000 gifts from viewers, handmade drawings, stuffed toys, notes, each one mattered. He cataloged them all and wrote a thank you letter to every single child who sent one. In 1969, he surprised everyone by bringing his young son, James, onto the show. At just 10 years old, James sat down with Daniel Tiger for an honest talk about growing up. Fred made room for giggles and interruptions. Behind the scenes, he installed a playpen in his dressing room and hired a babysitter. To Fred, family didn't belong behind closed doors. It belonged right there in front of the children watching. But not everyone believed in what he was doing. In 1970, PBS funding was under threat, and Fred found himself in front of a Senate committee. He had just 5 minutes to make his case. He told them his salary, exactly $28,000 a year, and compared it to commercial execs making $200,000. Then softly he recited a song he wrote about anger. The room went silent. Senator John Pastore leaned in and told him, "You've just earned the $20 million. That 5-minute testimony saved PBS. What few people knew was that behind the soft voice and sweaters lived an athlete. Diagnosed with mild hypertension in 1971, Fred began swimming 3 miles every morning at 5:30 a.m. He could bench 200 pounds. He did 100 push-ups a day and had the heart rate of a marathon runner. But he kept it secret because he didn't want parents thinking he was faking his gentle image. He wanted the focus to stay on the message. That same year, he introduced Lady Elaine, a puppet with a mischievous streak. She was inspired by his own guilt from childhood. At age 12, Fred had stolen a classmate's lunch every day for 2 weeks, then returned the empty box like nothing happened. Lady Elaine helped him forgive that part of himself. In May 1969, he did something bold. 1 year after Dr. King's assassination, he invited Officer Clemens, the first black cast member, to cool his feet with him in a small pool. Southern stations refused to air the episode. He got over 500 angry letters, some filled with slurs, but he responded to every one of them calmly. Personally, in 1972, tragedy hit closer. A close friend took his own life. Fred, a minister since 1963, fell into deep doubt. For months, he couldn't make sense of it. He wrote a script where Mr. Macaulay receives a letter from God about grief. The producers didn't want to air it. Fred insisted. It aired in early 1973 and became one of the most talked about episodes. He also produced a 5-part series during the Vietnam War called Conflict. The puppet King Friday built fences and declared emergencies. Kids learned about war through imagination. Parents were furious. Some called him un-American. But Fred never backed down. He mailed out copies, station by station, when CBS refused to air it nationally. Throughout the early 70s, Fred obsessed over stability. He began weighing himself every day, always in the same swimsuit and goggles, until he reached a perfect 143 pounds. 1 for I, 4 for love, and 3 for you. He maintained that weight for the next 30 years. It became more than a number. It became a message. More than a number. It became a message. By 1979, Fred won his first Emmy. But it didn't come easy. He wrote every word of every episode himself. Nearly 900 scripts over 33 years, he worked from 6 a.m. until 2 a.m. day after day. His wife Joanne found him asleep at the typewriter more than once. His language was so precise, so gentle, it needed to be perfect. He called it Fredish, a way of talking that made kids feel safe. In 1981, Fred Rogers was 53 when he quietly introduced something no one expected. He called it, "What Do You Do with the Mad That You Feel?" On the surface, it looked like a gentle PBS special about kids dealing with anger. But behind the scenes, this was something very personal. Years earlier, during seminary training in the 1950s, Rogers had admitted to struggling with his own buried anger. He had been bullied as a shy, overweight kid, and deep down, he once wanted to hit back. He never did. Instead, he waited decades and turned that feeling into something useful. In the show, Children weren't told to hide their rage. They smashed cardboard boxes, screamed into pillows, pounded clay. Rogers stood beside them calmly, telling them it was okay to feel what they were feeling. Not everyone liked it. Parents wrote in worried that the show was encouraging children to act out. Rogers didn't back down. He said it clearly. Bottling emotions was more dangerous than letting them out. What people didn't know was that this wasn't just theory for him. It was personal survival. By the time 1990 rolled around, Rogers had written 13 books, but in 1986, he wrote a manuscript that never made it to shelves. It was called The World of Mr. Rogers, and it included something most viewers never guessed. He had scars. As a teenager in the 1940s, Rogers had severe acne that left deep marks on his face. He hated how he looked. He wrote about spending hours in front of mirrors applying concealer. He learned makeup skills long before most actors did. He even spent his paper route money on high-end cosmetics. He chose television over in-person ministry because he thought his face would be a distraction in real life. In his draft, he shared how sometimes during sad episodes, he'd wipe off his makeup on camera on purpose so kids could see someone imperfect and still kind. But that chapter never saw the light of day. Publishers said it was too raw, so it stayed in a drawer while Rogers kept using makeup to hide his past in plain sight. In late 1988, he got the kind of news that changes everything. He was diagnosed with stomach cancer. He was 70. Most people would have stopped working. Rogers didn't. Over the next 2 years, he filmed 65 more episodes while going through chemotherapy. He got so sick during tapings that he would sometimes throw up between takes, but he never missed a shoot. He lost 40 pounds, but wore padding under his clothes so kids wouldn't notice. Instead of avoiding the topic, he worked his illness into the scripts. Daniel Tiger started having stomach aches and asking hard questions. That storyline came from Fred's own memories of being stuck in bed as a child, with fevers and pain he didn't understand. His final taping in December 2000 was hard. He could barely stand, but he recorded a full 15-minute goodbye scene anyway. 2 years later, he passed away, but not before doing everything he could to help children understand things he himself had once feared.